Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Cultivated Live. I am Jay Rosenthal. Two over is Jeremy Burke, and in the middle is Richard Hahn from the Niskanen Center. Richard, thanks for being here.
Thank you all for having me.
I got it right. Niskanen.
That's right.
Thank you for the helpful instructions as we get into this. We're going to get into what then with each other in our Slack channel because they are common sense. Before we get into that, not so much common sense, because common sense would imply that everybody would see it that way. Richard, give us a little bit about the Niskanen Center, then we're going to dive into it.
We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. We operate on several issue areas. I work in the criminal justice side of things. I think in general, our approach kind of defies political labels. Last year, we were part of a report the algorithm was unable to place. So I think it's a feather in our cap as far as like trying to be objective and stay away from some of the BS that DC typically is characterized by.
Yeah. What about your particular background personally?
Yeah, so I actually this report, this cannabis report, was really a return to some work that I did at the very beginning of my career. I got finished with undergrad, and I knew that I wanted to sort of work in policy. Specifically, I knew that I wanted to work in criminal justice policy. It just so happens I never went to a school that actually had a policy school. So I didn't really know what it took to get into the policy space, or even what you kind of did once you got there. But I got really lucky. I sort of blasted out my resume and cover letter to scores and scores of people, and this quirky professor at NYU responded to me out of the 40 or 50 applications I sent out. And he's a guy who may be familiar to y'all, Mark Kleiman. He was he was a professor at UCLA for a long time, and then at NYU before he passed away a few years back. And he hired me. That story is actually kind of interesting. It's a classic absent-minded professor story, because sort of like he had his assistants interviewing me, and I went to what I thought was the final round of the interview here in New York. And this is right after he had sort of been named by Washington State to be their pot czar, to sort of develop all their regulations. Yep. And he was staffing up, and I think he was either just so absent-minded or overwhelmed at that time that he thought somebody else had already hired me. I thought I was there for a job interview, so he's like,
"You're there to start work."
He's like, "All right, I need you to plan me a trip to Sweden by way of China." I was like, "I don't even live here yet," but it worked out really nicely. I worked for him for several years, and sort of this is the story of so many people, right? You start with drugs and then you move into crime. I initially we did a lot of cannabis work, and then we moved more into sort of prison programming, probation, supervision regimes, police department, patrol work, a lot of sort of applied economics, applying policy analysis and economics to criminal justice issues. So it was really fun to kind of do this report with a couple of good colleagues of mine, and kind of return to the beginning of my career and take a sort of clear-eyed look at how state markets have been doing since 2015, when I first got into this.
And Richard, before we dive into the report itself, I mean, why did the Niskanen Center do this now? Like, what was the sort of impetus? Was there anything that triggered the report, that triggered the look, or was it just sort of time to take a step back?
Well, we look at what our role is in the policy landscape as providing what we call legislative subsidy. And I guess you could more broadly talk about it as like governmental subsidy. We realize that most policymakers, they have to make decisions on a whole lot of different issues. They're non-specialists. A lot of them, are car dealers in Florida who for 2 months a year have to come to Tallahassee and write laws. And they don't really, they're not meant to be experts. That's not really the way democracy works. And so we realize that they a lot of times just kind of have to make decisions by the seat of their pants without good information. And so what is the point of a think tank if not to provide the sort of seed information that they need to make these decisions in a more informed fashion? So, I mean, I think we look for where there are problems and where there's an opportunity for this sort of legislative or governmental subsidy to make the most impact. And we look around and we just see, a couple of dozen cannabis markets at the state level that are just not doing that well, and
Yeah.
nobody seems to know what to do. So we thought we'd help out.
Yeah. I want to dive into the report, and I'll tell you. So when I was, at Cultivated, we get pitched a lot of things all the time. And so when things surface to the level that we're interested, it's because we are very interested. And so I want to read you a quote, Richard, from the executive summary, which you either probably wrote or edited, had a hand in. So it won't be a surprise to you, but I think for our viewers, it's a really good one. So the quote reads, "A state that legalizes cannabis but sets taxes too high, licenses too few retailers, or builds an unworkable track and trace system has not solved the prohibition problem. It has created a different one in which a legal market exists on paper, but an illicit one dominates in practice." I thought that summarized, both the subject of my reporting for the last 10 years extremely well, as well as the specific policy implications or recommendations, in the report. Richard, can you sort of react to that quote and think about it and why, a lot of these state-regulated cannabis systems seem to just feed the illicit market in many ways?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the problem is a lot of states were very enthusiastic about legalizing cannabis in the very beginning, and there was a tremendous amount of public will. I mean, I think one of the most striking sort of public opinion polls, right? Like
Yeah.
at the end of the Bush administration, beginning of the Obama administration, like 60% of Americans were against legalizing cannabis. And then by the beginning of the first
Right.
Trump administration, 60% of Americans were in favor of legalizing cannabis. So you see this in the space of less than a decade, you just see this 60-40 flop on pro versus con on legalization. And I think a lot of state legislators at the time, crime was really low, and crime and drugs were long sort of tied to one another in a lot of people's minds, and really, sustained low crime rates for the first 10 or so years of the 2000s. Really like bought a lot of goodwill, and people were willing to say, hey, there are probably too many people in prison for drugs. Maybe we could cut down on that if we liberalize some of our policies and our laws. And also, states were coming out of a recession in which after which they needed new sources of revenue. So states were not only excited about sort of, being less punitive and appealing to the new majority of people who wanted to be pro legalization, but also they liked new revenue streams as well. So they saw sort of had dollar signs in their eyes.
Right.
And again, this goes back to the point I was making earlier, where policymakers, a lot of times, they're not experts. They don't have a lot of information. They have to learn really, really quickly. So even in states that were, being more thoughtful than most about this, they maybe put together a blue ribbon commission, and they named some smart generalist, politically appointed person as like the point person on cannabis legalization. And then those people started to get lobbied. Right. That's when the hemp industry came in. That's when a lot of industry actors and honestly, they were providing the sort of service that we're trying to provide. It just so happens that they had a profit motive behind it. They were providing information, and they put their spin on it. And I think there was also a pretty widespread belief then that cannabis didn't have the sort of potential psychological harms that now are emerging. That there's more of a consensus that we need to be more careful about how much and how often people are using, what type of products they're using. People weren't thinking really critically about the public's health and safety guardrails. They were just like, let's legalize it as efficiently as possible because there was the perceived mandate to do that. And while we're at it, let's try to get as much tax revenue out of it as possible. And the other thing is, like, we can get into the whole tax regime system and everything as well. But like, the other problem is, like, cannabis is not sort of like other products where the harm of it is proportional to its weight, right? Or it's a little bit like alcohol, where there's a psychoactive substance in it. The harm is proportional to that. It just so happens it's really hard to capture tax revenue based on the amount of THC that's in something, because you have to have really reliable testing infrastructure. So there are all these barriers to sort of like getting the tax structure right. Some states, went really hard one way and jacked up the prices, the taxes really high, and made it really hard to get a license. And so you have these sort of like anemic markets where only a few really well capitalized players are involved. Some made it really easy, like too easy. And like places like Washington State, where like every year, like over a third of cannabis businesses would fail, or like in California, where you have like 50% of licensees in default of their tax obligations. So like you had this like patchwork of pretty bad cannabis regimes out there. And it's all because it was sort of like, it was rushed through, and we didn't
Right.
really have the thinking at the time to develop these tax structures correctly.
One of the other things, and it also, as it reads, and as Jeremy and I talk about this both like with people like you and experts and people in the industry as well, and amongst ourselves, like it's not just one of these things, right? It's not just the tax structure. It's not just how licensing works. One of the key things, especially if one of your policy goals is to drive down the illicit market, which everybody says it is, that could be contrary to some of those other things we talked about, right? Setting the right tax rate, for example, right? If you have dollar signs in your R's, you want to make the cannabis fairly expensive because you want to reap the benefit of taxes. First of all, that's diminishing returns on those tax dollars. But like that is counterintuitive to actually driving down the black market because the cannabis is now more expensive on the legal market, et cetera. But one of the things that also in each state regime, whether it's passed by voters or passed by legislatures, is local ability to opt out, and the strain that puts on licensing and the ability to crack down on the illicit market. Think about places like New Jersey and New York in particular, where real estate is so expensive that they've really created these like islands of cannabis, if you will, outside in New York, outside the city, but like islands of cannabis where everybody that wants a license goes to get one, but then you have a concentration of licenses and then huge swaths of the state without it. Like it's all of these things taken in a sort of soup mix that like put lots of pressure on both the legal market and actually less pressure on the illicit market.
Yeah, our solution to the cannabis deserts, if you want to call it that, and then it is really we don't want to tell a locality that they absolutely can't do something, right? We would like to defer to sort of local jurisdictions having sovereignty here. So we think the way around that is statewide delivery licensure, which also has the added benefit of creating more jobs because you have more people who perhaps participated in the illicit market and don't have the capitalization to sort of start their own cannabis business, but they can still kind of do a job that's similar to what they were doing in the illicit market. But in this, they'll have the benefits of being a legitimate employee as opposed to someone who's doing something illegal. So we think that's one solution to the thing. Yeah, California's really had a hard time with that sort of patchwork of, where do we cite the dispensaries? I think, the other thing to remember about this is like cannabis is something that like does create harms, but also probably doesn't need to be illegal. That's kind of the difficult thing. It's kind of the difficult thing for people to keep in their heads. And so a lot of people like looked for the closest metaphor they could find, and they're like, well, what's another thing that's like that? Well, like alcohol, so why don't we just like copy and paste what we did with alcohol? And, like some places have blue counties where you can, I'm from South Carolina, right? The South is full of a lot of places where like on certain days or all days, you can't buy alcohol. And like, that has never stopped anybody who wanted a drink from getting a drink. They just drive and get the drink, which creates three problems where in the first place there was only one. So I think statewide delivery is a good idea. I think there are a lot of options. Anyway.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Jay. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I live in Toronto, so I live in Canada, and in Ontario, there were municipalities that could opt out, and there's a government wholesaler in between the market and consumer. Like it seems to be like on its face a pretty shitty model, just because it's I'd say anti-market competitive. Although we have lots of dispensaries, the number of people that are buying on the legal market versus the illicit market is way outpaces what's happening in the States. Like, I don't know if there's a perfect model. There are maybe a mix of imperfect models out there, but like every state thinks they want to do this differently. And I guess sort of that's the question. Like you talk about sort of the patchwork, of course, of states, but also a federal role in this, and sort of in the context of what's happening on the federal level with rescheduling. Like, talk a little bit about in the report, sort of a federal role in the cannabis market or setting cannabis standards.
Well, I mean, ideally, the federal government has a relatively broad role in this. I mean, for one, as far as businesses are concerned, I think that the big leadership role that the federal government needs to exercise is just helping access to financial markets and commercial banking. It's very difficult for cannabis businesses to participate in the sort of pursuing capital from institutional lenders and even just, regular sort of doing business banking. They have a hard time participating in that. And that's because, again, cannabis is still illegal at the federal level. Now, that does not prevent the federal government from asking cannabis businesses to pay their full income taxes, right? So, it's a little like living in DC, like I do, where we have to pay taxes, but we don't get to vote for people in Congress, right? They get the worst of both worlds. They don't get to participate in capital markets, but they also have to pay income tax, and they don't get to write off. That's changing, but traditionally they also haven't been able to write off most of their business expenses as well. So the margins on the cannabis business were a lot worse. I just remember when I started this back in 2015, when I started doing this work, and you go to trade conferences, and it just like people would be like, "Oh, there's so much money," they're like, it's like. My old boss, Mark Kleiman, always said, never get into cannabis business unless you have $1 million to lose. And I think that's why we have so many licensees in California who are in default. That's why we have over half of licensees in default in California. So, people didn't think about how much money that they would have to put aside to just do the regulatory stuff, just to stay compliant with that. And yeah.
Well, it's that. I mean, the truth is, and Jeremy, we talk about this a lot, is a lot of states by design were welcoming in people who were justice involved or didn't have a track record of running a business. And not only that, the effort and cost to get to day one was just enormous. But day 1 to day 30 or 300 was also fraught with all kinds of market dynamics, which they were not in control of, which were also very complicated.
And a lot of people, a lot of businesses weren't making money, their first year. They were they weren't turning a profit for the first couple of years. And to have the sort of capital where you can absorb several years in the red is, you're not like these sort of social equity applicants. And that's one of the things that I hope it doesn't piss too many people off in the report. I hope that we've reached a sort of more circumspect place on this sort of thing, but we're very cagey about the social equity thing because so many states just put people who were not in a position to sort of invest their life savings in a business. They sort of set them up to we'll give you this easy on-ramp into this new industry, but it was an industry that really had tight margins, required a lot of regulatory and compliance savvy, and it also, it required large amounts of capital to keep going through periods where you just weren't making money. And so it's kind of like setting up these folks to fail when you could have done so many other things with this. And even if you really wanted to encourage them to sort of participate in this industry, then you could have set up low interest loans and set up business classes and set up incubators for these businesses. But states weren't willing to do that because a lot of times I think this came down to virtue signaling. They wanted the part of their justification for legalizing was that this has hurt so many communities. So here, we're going to make it better in one stroke. And that's what governments sometimes like to do. They like that silver bullet that makes everything better at once. And it wasn't that simple.
Yeah. I mean, Richard, you hit on this interesting idea. Anyone who's followed cannabis policy for, as long as cannabis policy has existed, the past 10, 12 years, the way these laws are written and the programs are designed is kind of a reflection of the society's attitudes at a time, right? At the specific time, right? In Canada under Justin Trudeau, it was all about public health and reducing teen use. And, they can say successfully they have, reduced teen use. It has ticked down. It's harder to access cannabis for teenagers than it was. At the same time, standing up an industry seemed to be incidental to that goal. Whereas in New York, post Black Lives Matter protests, post George Floyd, there was a lot of anger about that, anger about policing, and cannabis looked like a silver bullet to, touch on those social justice issues, touch on those social equity issues. But, there's a lot of good intentions that went to die, right? For the exact reasons you stated, where, you threw people who maybe haven't operated businesses or have operated businesses in much easier industries where they're not dealing with cost compression and loans, at usurious rates, et cetera. And so, I think it's an interesting nutshell. And so I agree with you. I mean, this is more of a statement than a question. I hope, we're able to have these conversations now and really look at what worked and what didn't. for states that are rolling out their policies now, because if you come at it ideologically, you're not going to meet all those goals at all. And I think we saw that in New York, we saw that in Ontario, we see that everywhere.
I think the best sort of long-term approach to cannabis, attitude towards cannabis, is grudging tolerance, right? Like, as I said earlier, it's like
your boss's line.
Yeah, like two
Yeah.
things can be true at the same time. Like, it can be a substance that produces harms, but it also probably shouldn't be illegal. So I think grudging tolerance is the way we need to approach that. And it's important we get it right. I just want to make the stakes clear for the industry as well, because you're seeing support for cannabis legalization peaked 3 years ago in 2023, and the support is actually declining. And largely because we've, to borrow yet another one of Mark Kleiman's great lines, we made a hash out of cannabis legalization. He was always one to lean into the giggle factor of these things. But yeah, I think that's and you look at also, these markets were designed by people who thought that the relationship between users and the substance would be similar to alcohol. They thought people would use like once or twice a week. The use sessions would be sort of concentrated. It wouldn't be like people using every day. And as we saw from the most recently released National Survey on Health and Drug Use, it's now like the consumption patterns look a lot more like cigarettes, where the modal user sort of uses every day. And that's not to say that that's like necessarily a terrible thing. It's just, I think it wasn't how the markets were set up. And we need to be like thoughtful about how use patterns are different than we expected, and how maybe we need to tweak the market a little bit. We try to avoid any sort of prescriptions, because we understand every state is a different little fiefdom and a little different animal. But two things to get to your question, Jeremy, about what seems to have worked. One thing that we really like is prohibition on vertical integration. And this is a hard pill for a lot of states to swallow, because vertical integration seems really good, because you have these stable companies, because to be vertically integrated, you have to be a fairly large, well-capitalized company. And so you have these stable companies that are seemingly easy to regulate. And then you sort of like get to like regulate them across the pipeline of, from seed to sale. You don't have to like have different companies interacting with a track and trace system, but it does sort of hedge out all the smaller operators, because you do have to be so big. And the other thing is we prefer a model that, instead of taxing at the point of sale, instead of having a business have to sort of set aside a portion of every sale to eventually pay taxes, because we also kind of think that creates some perverse incentives for people, particularly businesses operating on these tight margins, to like get behind on their taxes. And then that's why we have over half of businesses in default. We prefer the tax to be captured at the distribution level. And we also prefer a state distributor. So this is Michigan's liquor model, where they have producers, of course, or the big companies, and then the retailers are local stores, but the state is the distributor, and so they capture the tax in the form of the difference between the wholesale and the resale price. And so it's just like, it's already taken out. Whatever the retailer wants to sell it for, that's their profit. But you don't. It's all much more predictable in that sort of way, and it also allows the state to have an opportunity to sort of officially, on their own turf, test the product before it goes to the public in a controlled way. Because another thing that we find in the report is the testing infrastructure is really bad around the cannabis business.
Yeah,
it's by design. It's really bad. I mean, sorry.
Seemingly,
it's almost. I'm not making this argument. When people buy by the highest THC, it creates a perverse incentive to create that highest THC, no matter the means, testing or otherwise.
And eventually, I don't believe that we'll never have the ability to test THC accurately. It's tough now, but we'll get there. But I think this is another thing we try to. This is more of a, rather than a specific prescription, this is more of a vibe that we try to go through in the whole report, which is to say, like, just be flexible. Don't like set the tax at something in the very beginning and like, this is the word of God, like that we have to keep it at this tax level forever. Like, play around with it, see what works. If you find that businesses are unable to survive at a certain level of taxation, if you find that the illicit market is creeping back in at a certain level of taxation, like then alter it and experiment with it. Don't just like think that everything has to be the same and static all the time. And I think this is like a bigger message that we like to take to governments in all issues that they're having is just open your eyes and ears and be more willing to experiment and change things a little bit. And that's, I mean, easy for me to say, right? Like bureaucracies are intensely
Sure.
set up to be against change, but in a lot of cases, the regulators, the regulatory agencies for cannabis markets are new. You know, they don't have a lot of precedence. Maybe they have employees who used to work in the alcohol bureau, or they're started as attached to the alcohol bureau or something like. And a lot of times these are new bureaucracies, so there is scope and a chance to be a little bit more nimble and try to do things differently.
Richard, I want to ask a question because one of the things that has been top of mind for the sort of regulated cannabis industry on the state level, and sort of the hemp-derived outside of that realm THC products, including especially in places like South Carolina where you went to school, and in Congress too, and the White House. There's like this is all relative. Over the summer, this came to a head with funding for government. Like it seems to me, a lot of the things you're talking about, right? A more open market approach, the taxation issues, almost a 3-tier system, actually quasi has happened almost in the hemp derived space. Like, how does that factor into, or have you thought about how that factors into sort of what states are doing with their regulated cannabis industries, how legislators and maybe regulators are thinking about the hemp derived stuff, which has sort of exploded, especially among states without legal markets? Like, have you thought about sort of the interplay of those things and or a path forward for like low dose, maybe specifically beverages in the realm?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be especially cautious with concentrates and edibles and drinkables, I guess. It is striking to me. This is one of the most striking things to me coming back to this issue after several years not paying attention to what was going on very closely. That it's actually easier to buy cannabis products in South Carolina than it is in DC, and it's technically illegal in South Carolina, and it's technically legal in DC. But in DC, we used to have this sort of like 3-pronged market. Like DC was an interesting case study. We had the initial sort of barter market where you weren't allowed to sell it for profit, but there were ways around it where you buy sort of
I think you mean the good old days, Richard. No, I'm just kidding.
Where you buy like the $60 T-shirt and you get your free gift of weed, right? And then of course there was medical market, traditional medical market, and then for a couple of years there was much like there is in many states now, this sort of like gray area of hemp-derived products that were essentially doing the same thing psychologically. It's just they were able to call themselves a hemp product. And in DC, perhaps because we are so close to federal enforcement and because there's such a spotlight on us, most of the barter and hemp stores were shut down in the last couple of years, and we're left with only the medical market. So like most places with just a medical market, you have to sign up. You can self-certify, so it's not tremendously onerous to do. But it's more like a traditional thing where you have to give some personal information. You have to certify that you need this for a medical reason, and then the licensing authority then at some point months later says yes or no, and then you have a medical card. South Carolina, I mean, you can still go to the liquor store. Like I go to the liquor store by my parents' house in South Carolina, and the shelves are full of hemp-derived THC products. Right. It's like, and it strikes me as like not only problematic from like a public health standpoint because I don't know, there's very little control over what kinds of products are in these stores and there's no testing of the quality of these products. I think we probably need to, look at this with a microscope and not sort of gloss this over. It is a little surprising to me that states like South Carolina, just despite the closing of the hemp loophole in the Farm Bill, so technically these stores no longer should be around. There seems to be no will to sort of enforce against it, and part of that is, the cost of enforcement are not trivial. You got to have people who are willing to like go to the store and say, "Hey, that product's not allowed to be on the shelf, so here's a ticket," and you got to get rid of them. Like New York City, this is kind of fascinating, and this isn't
Yeah.
about cannabis, but like New York City is a massive city. We got like nearly 40,000 sworn police officers, but there's a massive problem with cigarettes being sold where taxes have been paid in another state. So it's tax arbitrage. People drive the cigarettes up here.
Yeah.
Tax has been paid, for like $6 a pack in North Carolina. They can sell them for $13 a pack up here. It's a massive problem. The city loses like $2.3 billion in revenue every year from this. However, the regulatory authority in charge of like going into bodegas and finding out if they're selling non-tax paid cigarettes is the New York City Sheriff's Department, which most people don't even know there is a sheriff's department, right? They are charged with court security and with tax compliance for like cigarette sales.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like 100 sheriff's officers, I guess they're called, who are in charge of going to all like 15,000 bodegas in the city and, like making sure they're all like tax compliant on their cigarette stamps, right? Like, and that's just like clearly the city saying we don't care about this enough to actually try to recoup some of that revenue that we're losing. And so like states have to realize like, I think a lot of states thought it was a win-win. It's like, we're going to get all this revenue. We're not going to have to spend money putting people in jail. It's like a win-win. And it's not. You got to spend money to make money. Anybody who runs a business knows that. It's just governments sometimes don't know that. And so you're gonna have to expand your enforcement infrastructure, particularly against the sort of gray market, illicit, quasi-illicit actors first, before you can sort of say, okay. But once you get everyone into the illicit market, it's much easier to. It's much less expensive to sort of just treat a business like a business. A business has a lot to lose, and so it's a lot easier to like hit them with administrative fines rather than sending cops in. So like once you get people to port over from the illicit market to the illicit market, things get a lot easier. But that you do have to make an initial outlay in enforcement, and that's something I think a lot of governments didn't realize.
I want to, if you have time, Richard, I want to introduce one more topic, and then
Sure.
we can wrap. We talked a lot in this discussion about, how support for cannabis has peaked. It's declining a little bit. And that could be a problem for the industry and for new markets coming online and rolling out. Talk a little bit about regulatory capture, because you address it pretty well in your report, that there's this tension between, the companies that can and should be spending money on lobbying. That's legal. That's what companies do. But there are very few public health voices that, in my view, have legitimate pushback to the industry, right? It's sort of drowned out by, fear mongering and the sort of the reefer madness of old, right? We're seeing that a lot more now. Talk a little bit about how the industry can and should advocate for itself while also, balancing these interests, knowing that support is declining a little bit.
Well, every other industry that legally produces an intoxicant that is still successful. I'm thinking of alcohol and tobacco markets
Sure.
specifically. Like every other industry has realized that like it's in their interest to do some of the harm mitigation themselves, to invest some of their profits in harm mitigation themselves. The tobacco companies, of course, were famously forced to do that in the late 90s. But since then, they've invested significant philanthropic dollars in harm reduction, smoking cessation programs. I think they're probably the biggest funder besides government sourcing for tobacco cessation programs. The alcohol industry does the same thing. I mean, part of that is sort of compulsory. Part of that is, we want good PR. And I think the cannabis industry has got to realize, like, to be sustainable, if it wants to maximize its profit, it also has to help the government do some of the job of maximizing public health and safety too. I remember one of the most surreal meetings I took when I was first working on this, and we were working for a lot of different state governments, either a governor's office or the legislature or some civil commission that had been set up by the legislature would hire us as outside consultants, and we do sort of a landscape analysis of the illicit market in the state. We'd figure out what it would take for them to port it to a illicit market and what kind of regulatory structure they need around that. And so, we take a lot of these meetings with, staffers for executives of states. And one, I just remember going in and they had been so heavily lobbied by the cannabis industry, but they were being taken on tours, of grow facilities upstate and these beautiful facilities, and they were talking about terroir, like how like the state was going to be known for like the terroir of its cannabis. And I was like, I just don't know, like, if the average smoker is thinking that way. The average, I think it goes to what we're seeing with the health, with the National Survey on Health and Drug Use, is like the average cannabis smoker is a little bit more like a cigarette smoker than they are like someone who like drinks fine wine. Like the average American is a lot more like the average cigarette smoker than someone who drinks fine wine. Like there will be a small group of people who are willing to pay like $100 for a gram for like the rarest of rare cannabis that tastes like, you know, mangoes and dolphins or something. But like most people are just like trying to get stoned. And like I think the other thing is the industry could be helpful on is data sharing, because to be fair, I want to caveat the use studies by saying it's very scary to hear that most cannabis smokers smoke, you know, at least once or use cannabis at least once a day. But we don't know very much about the intensity of each use session, and we don't know very much about like what type of substances they're using. Like it's very possible, and I'm not saying it's more than likely, but it's very possible that a lot of people are just checking, I use cannabis every day, and what they're really doing is like some kind of like cannabis CBD gummy thing that just helps them get to sleep, and that's not sort of a high harm potential use session, right? That's not something, and that's not something that's going to have this sort of like long term pulmonary effects or anything like that. It could, but the industry could really help us know more about what the modal cannabis user is, like how they're engaging with the product. I think that's a great place for sort of collaboration between industry and government to maximize public health, which should be the whole point of this. I mean, like, great if we can increase taxes, great if we can be less punitive and keep, you know, people out of jail for stupid drug crimes. But the main thrust of these policies should be maximizing public health and safety, and like. That does not mean prohibition, because prohibition certainly didn't maximize public health and safety. You were just using products that were sold to you by somebody's house you had to go to, and you had to spend time watching them play video games while you waited on them to weigh out your gram or whatever. And like, you didn't want to hang out with that person. Like, but like, you know, it's going to push people into less healthy choices. And I think that industry has a lot to lose by not engaging on public health and working with governments and beyond just sort of like complying with regulations.
I think that's a good message as we wrap this up. We do want to have you back because I think this has been an awesome conversation. And as I said, it's things Jeremy and I talk about a lot, because I think we talk to a lot of people in a lot of different states, including regulators, and their view too often, I think, is very focused on their own state, not what other people are doing well or what they could be doing differently, to be quite honest. And a lot of mistakes made from the inception that they actually have to fix in an ongoing way, which is also hard, right? Because a market in motion is a market that is hard to change.
Yes, indeed. And something like 24 states are learning that very hard lesson right now.
And I think that'll be even harder if there's some federal oversight or regulation or standards that they also have to comply with, which will be a whole different thing, right? With a whole other layer of costs and regulatory issues. But we'll cross that bridge, Richard, when we get there. Richard Hahn, thanks so much for being with us today. Jeremy, thank you. And as always, thanks for joining us here on Cultivated Live. Links to everything we talked about are in the show notes. Richard, thanks so much.
Thank y'all.
You got it.